إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد بعدد كل داء ودواء وبارك وسلم عليه وعليهم كثيرا اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another session on the Seerah. Today we're going to have a look at the Badu and his camel, the Bedouin and their camels. Nothing sets the desert scene with its archetypal Bedouin, the Badu with his camel next to him, tethered to his tent, and in front of the tent a small hearth with a fire going, and the Bedouin, the Badu, is making coffee, and then he invites you in. This is the archetypal romantic image that everybody has of the Bedouin. And while it's true that the Bedouins are part of the desert and they can't be separated, however, the coffee part is a recent phenomena. The ancient Bedouins didn't know coffee. Coffee was only introduced to them a couple of hundred, maybe 500 years ago, and in the 1700s it was introduced into Europe. But the Bedouin and his camel are inseparable, just as in the West we would say man and his dog. Man's best friend is the dog. The Bedouins, their best friend is the camel. So the best friend of the Badu is a camel. So we're going to have a look, we're going to set the scene of pre-Islamic Arabia and the Bedouin. Now, bearing in mind, the Bedouin were not the only representations of pre-Islamic Arabian society. They were on the fringes of the towns and the villages and on the fringes of empire. So they lived deep in the desert. They had a symbiotic relationship with the town dwellers, inasmuch as they needed certain things from the town dwellers and the town dwellers needed certain things from them. But generally the Bedouin kept to their liberated, free lifestyle away from all forms of authority. And the Bedouins could only maintain their lives, and especially you can say the embellished versions of their lives, because of the camels. Because it wasn't because of the camel, they wouldn't be able to travel the long distances they did, or be the people that would man the camels as guides and everything on the long distance trade caravans, or even to live as they did without the camel. So we'll start by looking at the camel, because the camel is a very interesting animal, and then we'll have a look at the Badu. So the Arabs, they can't live without the camel. They will prize their camel just like somebody in the West or somebody would prize a Lamborghini or a very expensive car, or prize horses, those race horses with good lineages in the West and in the East. Just like they prize, the Bedouin would prize his camel. They would recognize them. They would be able to pick them out camels generally travel in a train, in a large group. They're gregarious. They don't like to be separated from each other. But a Bedouin can actually call his camel and it will leave the train and come to him. And they know them so well that they know them by their walk, they know them by certain indicators on the body that you would not be able to see. The Bedouin would know his camel. So imagine what a car did for man. So man used to travel before the car, then they domesticated horses that allowed them to travel further, and then we had the supercar. So exponentially, by a 10 or 100, that's how their travel increased, the speed increased, everything increased because of the car. The same thing happened with the domestication of the camel for the Bedouin. Interestingly, the camel did not originate in Arabia. It originated in North America, and just like horses, they crossed over during the ice ages, or when the oceans were lower and there were land bridges between North America and in Siberia, and then they made their way down, from Siberia into Central Asia, and then into Iran and into the Arabian Peninsula. They were first domesticated during the 3rd century BC in Somalia or Saudi Arabia. Now, this is contentious because we're not too sure really when they were domesticated. There is conflicting evidence on this, but we'll go by this, that they were first domesticated during the 3rd century BC, so which is quite a late date. That means we have instances of camels being used by prophets in the Bible. Abraham himself used camels. Some of the other prophets used camels. Now, either our knowledge of knowing when the camels were first domesticated is wrong, and they really did use camels, or the biblical stories are anachronistic, which means that they've juxtaposed camels onto a timeline that superseded the domestication of a camel. We don't know for sure. More research is needed on this. So the Babylonians and the Assyrians referred to the dromedary as gamalu. That's what they knew it as in their language, in the Semitic language, gamalu. So in the Bible it was called gamal, and the Greeks referred to it as dromos. That's where we get the name dromedary from, meaning a swift runner. Or they use the loan word camelos, again camel from there. Camel corps were employed for warfare by the Persians, the Greeks, the Seleucids, the Parthians, the Sassanians, the Romans, and the Nabateans. So everybody who had access to camels used camels, and especially in those areas, semi-rugged desert type land, the horses' feet would sink into the sand, and horses actually were swift animals, so they were used when you're about to face the enemy. Otherwise the horses would not be ridden. It would be the camels that you would ride, and in fact you could take the camel into war as well, and you'd sit higher than a horse anyway on a camel. So depending on the type of warfare, like a cavalry charge, depending if you needed a very swift cavalry charge, it would have been a horse. If you needed a slightly slower one, it would have been a camel, and then your foot soldiers and everybody else would do their own job. It was depending on strategy and war what you would use. The first recorded use of the camel for military purposes was by an Arab king, Gindabu, Jundab, which means locust. We mentioned this in one of the previous lectures, in the Battle of Qarqar, which was in 853 BCE. It was reported that this particular Arab ruler used 1,000 camels in alliance with 12 other tribes that fought against the Assyrian king Shalmaneser II. The Bactrian camel in around 2500 BC in Iran. Now there are two kinds of camels, two species of camels. They are distinctly related to the llamas of South America, but the camels we're concerned with, you have the double-humped Bactrian camel, and then you have the single-humped Arabian camel. Now, it's the Arabian camel that features predominantly in all camel stories. The Bactrian camel is a very endangered species at the moment, and it was used in Central Asia, which is like the furthest flung part of the world, along the Silk Road, Mongolia, northern China, very far away from our centers of civilization that we know, which would have been the Levant, which would have been the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, and the Greeks, and then the Arabian empires. So we're more familiar with the single-humped Arabian camel as opposed to the much larger and fuller Central Asian camel. Here's some images of camels carved in rock in Arabia. And you can see that underneath them there's an old language as well. This fascinating picture here is of a camel that was actually not carved into the rock but carved out of the rock, meaning that they tried to make it as a 3D image, And we didn't know how old this was, but the latest research tells us that this is from around 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. So this sheds some interesting light in our understanding of what the people of that time knew about camels. They certainly knew about them. Were they domesticated? If you're going to be drawing them like this, and you're going to be going out of your way to draw a huge image of them like this, so they must have meant something to you. So were they domesticated at this early date? We don't know as of yet. So the average camel can produce between 6 to 9 liters of milk per day. Now camels are supremely suited to their desert environment. It's like hand and glove. The camel and the desert it's like hand and glove. That's how well suited they are for the desert, and we'll have a look at that now. So the average camel can produce between 6 to 9 liters of milk per day, but some populations bred specifically as dairy animals can yield up to 30 liters of milk per day. That's a huge amount of milk per day. The milk is a whole food, meaning that's all you can live on, and that's just as well because the Bedouins didn't have much to eat, so they could live off camel milk. And it's high in vitamins, iron, proteins, and has antimicrobial and immunological properties. Can't get that word out. So the Arabs were so familiar and so in love with their camels that they had a large number of words to describe them as well. So they described them by their breed, by their color, if they were riding animals, if they were herd animals, different animals. Like for each year of its life, they had a different name for it until it was fully grown. And even as it was growing older now, so it's past its zenith and it was growing older, they would have names for it. They would have terms for barren females, for one in calf, one in milk, which depending on how long they had been in calf or in milk. So the bond was so great. It was like the Mongolians with their horses. The Mongolians were inseparable, and they say for a Mongolian that the child learns to ride before he can walk. And then there's this stereotypical image of the bow-legged Mongolian, because they say that they would sit on their camels, on their horses for so many hours. They would even just sit there for jokes, conversing with each other, just sitting, that their legs actually became bowed as they grow older in the shape of the body of the horse. This was the relationship that the Arabs had with the camels. Now a camel can be a very aggressive animal, so it takes skill to handle, and it's a big animal, a powerful animal, and its bite is enough that it can crush bone. And there are many stories, many stories through the ages of people suffering attacks by camels. They can sit on you and crush you, and they can bite you. And Thizija, we're going to mention later on, mentions an Arab that was attacked and the camel actually bit his whole kneecap off. And there's a video on YouTube where you can see a camel grabbing a man completely by its neck. The head of the human the neck is in the camel's mouth. And it was like a show animal, it was like a circus animal, so it wasn't killing him, but that's how big they are. And you can see other videos of where it grabs a man and flings him by his head. And camels are very powerful animals. They can be very hard to manage and very fearsome as they approach you, because they're truly huge beasts. Very noble beasts as well, slightly uptight and slightly arrogant animals, the way they compose themselves. So the Bedouins of the time, if you were someone who was a shepherd of camels, it was seen as, wow, you're a shepherd of camels, as opposed to the poor shepherd of sheep, of kharuf, that was only shepherding something very small and meager, whereas camels are majestic and like that. So the Bedouins would use every part. Pre-modern societies generally tended to use every part of an animal for eating, and then every other part of the animal that they couldn't eat, they'd use it into some service in their life, such as leather and even the wool and the hoofs and things like that. So their dung was used as fertilizer and fuel. You'd burn the fuel. Their fur was used, the meat was used, and the milk was used to make cheese, curd, and things like that. A camel can weigh up to 500 kilograms, and it can feed a large number of people. So when you slaughter a camel, it's not just I'm slaughtering a camel for my family, you're literally slaughtering a camel for like 15 families complete that would be able to eat. A camel can go a week or more without water, and it can last for several months without food. It can survive a 40% weight loss and then drink up to 32 gallons, that's 145 liters of water in one drinking session. So no other animal can do that, and camel needs to do that because it's in the desert. So between one watering hole and another watering hole, there's large distances. So it's the heat will, the intense sun and heat will dehydrate you. A camel carries on. It's stoic. It just plods on. It can lose up to 40% of its weight, and it can lose a large amount of water. And when it drinks, it's not going to drink every day. So when it drinks, it can drink a huge amount of water. Contrary to what people believe, a camel's water is not stored in its hump on its back. That's a hump of fat. And you'll see certain pictures where the hump is just kind of dropped, drooping. And that's because there's no fat there, and it's just a piece of skin now. But as it fattens up, the hump kind of fills in with fat. Just like you get certain other animals like sheep that carry fat on its rump and things like that. They're very fast animals. They can run up to 40 miles per hour for short bursts. They can move comfortably at 25 miles per hour, and they can live for 40, 50 years. So you can imagine a camel that's living for 40 and 50 years. It's going to have a very intense, strong bond with its owner, and the owner itself will have a very strong bond with that camel. So the Bactrian camels have 2 humps, and the normal camel has 1 hump. Their lips and tongue are very tough, and they have mouths lined with firm papillae, that's the fleshy protrusions. These help in the camel eating what it eats. And camels, they can eat cactus. So cactus with its long spikes that if you grab it, you'd have to let go because it would hurt you. Cactus is a very tough plant, and camels can literally bite and start to chew with all those spikes. And it sounds amazing. There are many videos on YouTube like this. People are shocked to see this, how a camel can do that without bleeding or puncturing its lips or its gums or anything. And even as it ingests it, camels are able to do that because that's their food, and they need to be able to do that, and that's the way Allah designed them. So most animals lose up to 15% of their body weight in water. They lose up to 15% of water, and before they suffer any adverse effects. But a camel can lose up to 25% of its water. So a camel's nostrils, they retain the water. So the water isn't, when you exhale out, we exhale water vapor. The camels, it doesn't exhale the water vapor. It's actually caught by the end, by its nose, and it's taken back into the body to be recycled, because obviously camels need water. They have flat pads on their feet. If you look at a camel's foot, they're like flat, big pads that help them not sink into the sand. They're called the ship of the desert because of its rocking motion, and it's quite a ride. It's quite a cardiovascular ride to be sitting on a camel. You're constantly moving, and you have to get into this rhythm, and it's more than when you ride a horse. So it is quite strenuous to be riding a camel. Their fur is an excellent insulation from the heat. It helps keep heat in, it cools the camel, and it protects it from the rays of the sun as well. They have a third eyelid on their eyes as well, and they have long bushy eyebrows, hairs from the sandstorm and the rays of the sun. So with its long eyebrows, it protects it from the rays of the sun, and they have like an extra eyelid. And during a sandstorm, when people can't breathe, if you've ever been in a sandstorm in the Arabian Peninsula, it's not something you want to be in. Just even fine dust in the air, you breathe it in and it starts burning your lungs. And that's the reason why you see the Bedouins completely wrapped around when they're traveling in the desert, because of the sand kicked up and obviously the heat as well. So the camels, they have they close their nostrils, they will close their eyes, and they will just, the sand will be hitting them, but they will be protected. Its milk has more vitamin C than a cow's milk, and its fur reflects the sun to help keep it cool. And they're herbivores, which means that their diet is basically grass, plants, grains, wheat, and oats. So, to really get an understanding of how Bedouin life was, you'd have to read accounts of like 100 years ago, 200 years ago, or 500 or 1,000 years ago. Because today, nobody can really claim to be a full-on Bedouin. The Bedouin, even the ones that roam season to season, from one watering hole to another watering hole, or from one place of herbage for the animals to another place. The camels basically lead them. They know where they need to be when the rains come and everything. Even they're not fully dependent on their Bedouin way of life, the camel and everything. They have access to some sort of technology. They will have a car, a pickup, or a mobile phone, or something like that. We need to go back to the early period of when the state of Saudi Arabia was born, like the early part of the hundreds, the third state, which would be in the 40s, 50s and 30s, during that time. And even then, writers would write that technology was encroaching. So if we want to get an idea of how the archetypal Bedouin used to live, we need to look at accounts of the 50s and 40s like that. Now, can we say as an historian that, we look at the Bedouins in the 50s and that's exactly how they were 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago? We can't say that definitely, but we can certainly gouge a picture of something of their life. And especially before modernity, most things didn't change for thousands of years anyway, especially in isolated communities like that. Now, in city communities, yes, technology changes, fashions change, culture changes, rituals change. But for desert communities and very isolated communities, whether you're forest communities or mountain communities, things change slower. So it's safe to say, yes, there was some semblance of the way the Bedouin lived if we look at the way the Bedouin lived now, up till the 50s. So you can look at the Bedouins of the southern Arabian desert, like the northern Arabian desert, the southern Jordanian desert. That would be the Bedouins of Jordan, Bedouins of Syria, and then you'd have the southern deserts, which would be Arabia proper, which is Saudi Arabia today. That would be around the Najd area, and then Rabul Khali. You wouldn't have Bedouins living in Rabul Khali, the empty quarter, but on the outskirts you'd have. Now, in 1979, there was a man called Wilfred Thesiger. He was a renowned British explorer, and he had explored the empty quarter twice. He was probably one of the only few that we know about, him and somebody else, and they're the two accounts that we know about. If anybody did it before him that never mentioned it, we don't know, but it probably didn't happen. He did the empty quarter, so he traveled from one side of the empty quarter to the other side using local guides, and he wrote his accounts in a book called Arabian Sands, which I have here, in 1950. In 1959 he wrote this book. And his excuse for doing it was that he worked for the, I think it was the Foreign Office or like in the Department of Pestilence, where locusts. So Arabia has huge breeding grounds for locusts. In my time over there, every year we'd see hundreds and thousands of them. On the way to Medina, at every rest stop in Mecca, in Medina, we would just see hundreds and millions of locusts everywhere, like black ones and then the other type of ones. Their breeding grounds are in Arabia, southern Arabia. So the British wanted him to go and find the breeding grounds, and that was his excuse. He actually didn't really care for that. He just wanted to be out there and explore. So he did this twice, and he's got a fascinating account of the Bedouin, which we're going to read verbatim from the book of how they used to live. He spent 5 years with the Bedouin, and he said this is a changing world, but he saw the last of that world. Now, two of the companions that he were with were 16-year-old boys then, and there are YouTube documentaries made on them in Arabic. They live in Dubai now, I think it is, and they're old men, and then they recount how their life used to be, and they talk about this gentleman as well. This guy was one of the last quintessential English explorers from Empire. Even though Empire was coming to an end, then he was one of the last explorers that, when he explored large parts of the Empire. So Afghanistan, Kashmir, I think it was, Kurdistan. He spent, I think, 10 years with the Marsh Arabs in Arabia, in Iraq, and he spent 5 years with these. But he didn't really mention much about any of his other travels. He wrote a book on the marsh Arabs, and he wrote a book on this, on the desert Arabs, because I think they moved him and affected him the most. And what he saw there, that experience, even though it was much harsher than his other experiences, you know, it moved him that much that nothing compared to what he had experienced there. And a part of him wanting to do that was he wanted to endure hardship. I don't know why, he just wanted to endure hardship and test himself. The other person that made the voyage was Bertram Thomas in 1932, followed by John Philby. So these two made it, and then he made it in the 1940s. But the other two had some modern equipment with them. So, you know, they would have probably like radio or something like this. But Thizija had nothing with him, nothing. Yeah, he traveled as the Bedouin did. He ate with them, slept with them, dressed like them, lived like them. And he said, in the desert, I found a freedom unattainable in civilization, a life unhampered by possessions. So he made his first crossing, a circular journey by camel of some 1,500 miles in 1946. He took, the only modern equipment he took was a camera. Thank God he took that. He left a record of thousands upon thousands of photographs that he gave to the Pitts River Museum in Oxford, and you can see these pictures. It's truly a treasure. Because don't forget, Saudi Arabia developed very late compared to the rest of the world, so we don't have much photographic record. Like, so most people don't know what their grandfathers look like or live like. Most Saudis today, especially the youth, I would question them and they wouldn't know how their ancestors lived. Even like 2 generations before, they didn't know. Because there's no record and there's no education. So his images are truly a treasure for mankind. And really, if you go back and look, you know, today we have oil-rich Gulf states, and we think this is how they always were, with their beautiful thobes and their headgear. And even if there was no oil, okay, they were on their camels with beautiful thobes. No, they lived in a very desperate state. You know, it was nothing to write home about, saying, oh yeah, I'm a Bedouin. You know, it's very harsh living, and he's captured all of that. Their semi-naked bodies, you know, the simple utensils, how they would cook. You can find on YouTube old video footage, especially from like British Path, I think it was, and Aramco. They would show these these early images of Arabia. It was desperately poor. So it's not something that anybody could claim that, yes, I would like to live like this. In fact, the Arabs are glad that they've actually moved away from that sort of lifestyle, because that's how desperately difficult it was. The harshest climate in the world, you've got nothing, you're living extremely poor. Only the hardest men and women can live like that with their very hardy camels. So he saw Arabia just before it changed, at the cusp of its change, and this is a preserved record for us from a modern person of how he saw that transition. So he's describing Bedouins as they were up to that point. And his description is interesting for us because he's a modern person. He's not even like a Victorian where they had half of our technology, like where people went, Bukhat, and then there was that female traveler that went, and they left their descriptions. You know, they could identify in a certain way, probably more than us, but we wouldn't be able to identify with them because we're a generation removed, whereas he is from our generation. So we can, if he's talking about something, we can understand what he's saying exactly, and then understand what he's talking about, those Bedouins. So his account is actually good to read. Also, the accounts of the previous generations from the 1800s, 1900s, of people that went to Arabia, it's good to read their accounts too. So Bedouins are famous for what? Bedouins are famous for their harsh living conditions. Everybody knows this. Even the Arabs from the cities, the Hadara, right? When they look at the Al-Arab al-Ba'ida, the ones from the out of the cities, they will tell you how difficult their life is. They're nomadic lifestyles. So Bedouins don't carry nothing on them. They move from one place to another place. They only have their cooking pots and a few skins, and that's it. Whatever they need to survive. And so they never settled in one place. They could literally spend decades moving. You know, you'd find them here seasonal and here seasonal. And sometimes you'd find them, like if you were to track them 30, 40 years down the line, you'd find them in the other side of the peninsula. They're famous for their poetry, right? Their pre-Islamic Arabian poetry is legendary for its use of language. Not so much its descriptive nature of the environment, even though they do describe the environment, but there's not much to describe. I mean, desert. How many different ways is there to say a desert and sand and a sky and maybe like waquf al-atlal, yani standing at the ruins and the campsite, and how many ways can you describe that in? But the richness of their language, and that it's very important that that poetry was preserved and is preserved, and it's used when you want to find certain Quranic vocabulary, you want to get a deeper understanding of it, it's good to look at the pre-Islamic vocabulary to know that. Now, that's not to say that the Arabs, this is a misconception that people have, that they wrote poetry of such a high caliber. Right? I don't buy that the Arabs, the desert nomads or the desert Arabs outside the cities had the purest language. I would still say that it was the city dwellers and the academics inside those cities that had the purest language. If we go out of civilization today and we move into villages, so any country you go to, if you move into the villages, you'll find that their language changes and they start to use vocab that you wouldn't understand, right? And their language isn't of the same caliber as academic language would be. And you'd find that in Europe, you'd find that in America, you'd find that in Asia, in Africa, everywhere. So yes, they had poetry, but they had their own Nabati poetry, which we'll have a look at in the lecture on poetry, inshallah, or they recited poetry that was written by greats of their own, pre-Islamic civilization. But they were nonetheless, they were known for poetry. They're known for camel breeding. You want the best camels? Go and find a Bedouin, and he'll sell you a beautiful camel. They're known for their raiding. Bedouin are very famous for their raiding. Raiding wasn't so much. Raiding is a necessity. So you needed to raid to survive. You needed to lift camels. And they would help you in your own survival because everybody was desperately poor. So sometimes it was done as sport. Other times it was done out of necessity. And raiding is a specific style of warfare. It comes up in the Sīrah of Rasulullah as well, which we'll mention about later on. They're known for their legendary hospitality. There are very famous stories. Ghalib Pasha, Major Ghalib Pasha, he mentions Lawrence of Arabia will mention it in his books that they've written, and certainly Tizija mentions the Arab extreme hospitality they showed. Some of the stories that come from the top of my head, Ghalib Pasha mentions in Jordan, in the southern desert of Jordan, where there were forces aligned with the government, with Major Pasha, and then there were Bedouins. And as they were fighting, 3 Bedouin ran behind a rock or something. 2 of them were killed or something. 1 escaped. And as that one guard went towards the rock, the Bedouin stepped out and he said, "Give me a protection." Now that other Arab was duty bound now, honor bound to give him his protection. So all of a sudden now, he's gave him his protection, he's turned around and he said to his companions, "If you come closer, I'll shoot you dead." Why? Because he's asked for protection and I'm honor bound to give it. There's another case of where a small battle or raid, something happens and one guy is shot and left for dead. Out in the desert, he's left for dead. Now the next day, he miraculously survives and he crawls back towards the encampment and he ends up in the same camp of the tent of the guy that tried to kill him because he had killed his son or something like that. Now you've walked into your enemy's tent. Right now he has to now replace that sword or the dagger or the gun for coffee. So straight away the other Bedouin puts his sword down or his gun down and goes and starts to make coffee. Subhanallah. That's the level of hospitality. That you are an enemy outside my door, but the minute you've entered my abode of peace, you are now my honored guest. So for as long as you stay here, you are safe. These are the 2 stories that come to mind. I'm sure there's probably a few more. And you normally find this sort of hospitality with many traditional societies. It's only when we live in cities that we end up in a capitalist environment where greed takes over, and we compete with each other, and then over a certain amount of time we forget who our neighbors are, then we forget who our cousins are, then we even forget who our brothers are, and it's just me, me, me. Whereas the Arabs didn't have nothing. They just had their honor, their dignity, their name. I'm talking about the ones from Dubai, the desert, the rulers. And if you go to remote areas like where the Kurds live, or the Pashtuns live, the Yemenis, remote societies, they still have this code of honor that they live by and that they conduct. And their code of honor would allow them to be killed than to dishonor themselves. So one man will sacrifice his whole tribe. A chief will sacrifice his whole tribe just for his word. This is what the Pashtun did when they harbored Osama bin Laden. They said to America, if you really think that he did what he did, show us the evidence and we'll hand him over to you. But he's under our protection. Until you don't show us the evidence, we can't hand him over to you. And that's exactly what happened. Right? America invaded, destroyed the Taliban of 20 years ago, but they didn't hand over their person. Why? Because they were honor-bound. You'll get similar stories in all traditional societies. We can just name all of them. All traditional societies were like this, some more than others. And depending on your family name also, some of these things are imprinted in you from childhood. Some of these things are even in your DNA. And some of these things, your family name, you're duty-bound, honor-bound to hold on to these things, even if you don't want to, for the sake of your family name. Now, this sort of extreme, some people would say this is extreme, but this is a natural way of life for people. There's always two extremes to everything. So this lends itself to problems as well, and we'll have a look at some of those problems as well. But they're known for having a code of living and for their hospitality more than anything. Their code of honor and their hospitality. That's it. I remember the third one. Lawrence of Arabia said, show a gun to a Bedouin and he'd fight you to the death. But take him by his hand in love and you can lead him into hell and he'd follow you. That was the other quote. Thisages, his experiences, where he said that the Bedouin, the raw Bedouin, are very, very generous. They never show greed. So if food is being eaten, they won't squabble over who gets the most or who gets the least, like he saw the city dwellers, along the edge of the desert, the small towns and everything, like he saw them do. He goes, the noble, real, true Bedouin Arab is a very generous person. Some of them had nothing. They had lost their small fortunes just by entertaining people. And people would say that this man had wealth and now he's got nothing. And normally you would say, well, that's pretty foolish. You've lost everything. You hosted too many times without worrying about where the food was going to come for tomorrow, and today you're left with nothing. But they would actually praise those kind of people. You could be left penniless and homeless and dirt poor, and they'd praise you, saying, what a man, if only we were like that. And he mentions one of these stories in his book. He talks about a famous story of the Arabs and this is the story of one of the companions that did this also, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praised him for this, where a boy and his mum and some guests came, and there was not enough food to go around, so they dimmed the light, and there was like a piece of rope there, and his mum said, each time they look at you, just grab the end of the rope. Grab the end of it, and they'll think you're grabbing like a piece of meat or something, and just make out you're eating. And it's really funny that every single time the boy did this, everybody in the darkness shouted, you're holding the wrong end of the rope. Meaning that they all knew what he was doing. That this is Arab hospitality. Everybody's equal. Everybody knows this. He said they're very stoic. He goes, they're very lively. They'll tell you the same joke, the same story a million times. Each time they'll tell you like it's the first time you've heard it. But he goes, they also have the ability to be very calm, very collected, very stoic. They can sit for hours. Like when people interact, especially in countries that have newly industrialized or developed, when you have to deal with the government, sometimes you have to wait for hours to get registered, for example, for a hospital or for government registration cards or what like that. They would sit for hours in silence, just observing. But nothing missed their eye. Even if they were casually doing something, nothing would miss their eye. This makes sense because in a desert environment, it's survival. The smallest details you need to be able to see. And he goes, the only thing that would silence them when they were talking away amongst their group in the desert was if someone burst into poetry. He goes, it was like it was sacred for them. Then they all went silent. A hush overcame everybody. They listened to that poetry, and the only time they would interrupt is to finish off the last verse, which they all knew. And when moved, Arabs easily break into poetry. Now this is one of the pre-modern man, right, would read more, would be focused more, and there were less distractions, technological distractions. So that would naturally enhance their memories. So they were able to, and I'm not talking just the Arabs, this was everywhere. You could recite something in front of them and they would remember it verbatim. And how many a time do we have instances of Arabs spontaneously breaking into poetry? We have the story of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq and Bilal when they were in Mecca, in Medina, and the climate of Medina didn't suit the Meccans, and they got very ill, and Abu Bakr was delirious, and his daughter came to see him, and he's on the floor, both of them are on the floor. In his delirium, he recited a few lines of poetry, and Aisha's like, oh, okay, he's still alive, he's just not well. So if you think this is very strange, that how can people do this? How can they burst into beautiful poetry? What about rappers and musicians today? Have you not seen a rapper? He would just start to make lyrics up on the spot. He'd make one line and say, oh, I could build on that. And then he'd start to rap and add lines and add a beat to it himself. And then within like half an hour, he's got a song for you. And I saw this done in front of my own eyes. So it's certainly possible that the Arabs do this, and they did this. And that's the reason why we have hadith, where long lines of hadith are memorized straight away, heard once by the companions and memorized. Why? Because that's just the way they were. They never had no distractions. So there was no filter between that voice or that action being seen by the eye and being imprinted on the brain, or being heard by the ear and in its purest form being imprinted on the brain. And it's like, imagine like when you're in your early 20s or your late teens, you hear something once and it's memorized straight away. But as you grow older, due to the weakness of your brain, the feebleness of your brain, the hardships you suffer in life, the problems you have, the anxiety you have, everything becomes clouded. And now there are many filters before the information gets to your brain, so it's harder to do that. That's why they say early morning for kids who are memorizing the Quran, wake up early, because first thing in the morning your mind's blank, there's nothing on your mind. You haven't seen things to think, oh, I saw that today, oh yeah, that. No, everything is blank, so you memorize Quran and it imprints. The saying goes, the Arab saying goes, carving on rock, memorization for an old man is like painting on water, whereas memorization for a young man is like carving on rock. And that's true, it sticks forever. Sajda also describes the relationship that the Arabs have with their camels. He even mentions that one camel was literally like a dog, right? So every night the camel would come to him and groan near him as he was sleeping, and smell him, and then go back and then keep looking back. And nobody could ride that camel except for, like, if you had a cloth of the owner, and then you had that cloth on, and then the camel would smell the owner, and then that's how you could ride that camel. How you could call a camel and it would come out. How he was challenged by another Bedouin to call out his camel, and the camel turned around and came to him. He says he saw no sight more finer than a man mounted on a fine-bred camel. So he describes that their water skins that they have, the Bedouins had water skins. Now, Bedouin life is very hard. You must understand that it's all life back then was a life for survival. So you need to take steps to ensure your survival for the next day. So that means being by a water hole, having the water that's palatable. All desert water is disgusting to taste, but yet you have to drink it. Being in a position to get that water, having certain food items on you that maybe nobody else could eat, but you'd have to eat. So like some of the meat would probably be going off. You'd find like you'd probably have curds and that smelling really badly. The water would in the bags would smell really badly. So they'd have like bags of skin. So it could be a huge a huge goat skin, or even a camel skin. You tie the ends and you'd fill it with whatever you needed. So butter, oil even, flour or rice or water. And what do you think it would taste like each time you took whatever you were going to eat or the water out of it? It would taste and smell like goat. And that's exactly how he describes it. He said that they would put butter in lizard skins, and the lizard skins were like 18-inch longs, and there'd have butter in there. Now don't forget, there are certain tribes in Saudi Arabia, in the Najd especially, that would eat dab, which is a lizard. So they didn't make kabsa. Kabsa is normally made from chicken or from meat, but they have kabsa made from lizard. And then there's a story of Rasulullah where he was invited to a meal and he was given lizard. He didn't eat it, but Khalid ibn Walid ate it all up. And Thizija says that the Arabs don't need nothing from outside. Even though it would help them, he goes, but they know their affairs best, so leave them to their own affairs. They've managed to survive for thousands of years and they'll carry on surviving. And it's true, because modernity has taken away the Arab spirit. It's taken away the Bedouin spirit, the hospitality and everything. It still exists, but in a watered down version of what it used to be. And the hardship has gone now. So back to the goat skins. The goat skins would be rolled up at night time. So it's a very light thing. You can roll it up. In the daytime, when you need to fill it up with water, it's easy to fill up. It's easy to mend. Goat skins naturally sweat, which means that over time the water will kind of sweat out of there. You can heal them, you can cure them by using butter or pieces of splinters in there. You know, it's a versatile equipment. He also says that no race of humans would praise lineage more than the Arabs. Now it's interesting because in Mukhtasar al-Quduri, in the book of marriage contracts, it mentions there that the kuf, primarily kuf, suitability for marriage, is used by, it's only for the Arabs. Why? Because those Arabs value lineage more than anybody else on earth. Although I've seen people in other parts of the world that value lineage also. But having said that, it's to be known that first is Islam. So number one, you look at the person's iman, and then secondly, you look at lineage and everything else. And it's certainly true, the Arabs do recognize their lineage, their generation after generation they know, and they prize their lineage more than anything. So I'm going to read from the book now, because I can't do justice to what Thizla said, but we'll read something from the book to see what he's talking about when he discusses the Bedouin. He's talking about his desert journey. I mounted and we rode after the other. I could see them a couple of miles away, a cluster of tiny dots moving impeccably across Arabia. I thought they could go on and on until at last they came to Syria or Transjordan, and they would probably not pass a village or even a palm tree. And yet it is as far from here to Damascus as it is from the southern tip of India to the Himalayas. I wondered idly how many Arabs there were in Arabia. Between 6 and 7 million is, I believe, the generally accepted figure, and of these only about a quarter are Badu. Yet only Badu can live in the deserts that cover all but a small part of Arabia. The other Arabs have settled in the few places where it is possible to make a living from the soil. Except for some serfs and the rabble in a few of the larger towns, all these Arabs are tribesmen. Most of them live in the Yemen, that fertile corner of Arabia which the Romans called Arabia Felix. Perhaps it was there that the Semitic race originated. They themselves divide their race into the Arab, Al-Araba, or pure Arabs, and they say are descended from Qahtan or Joktan, and originated in the Yemen, and the Arabs, Al-Musta'riba, or adopted Arabs, descended from Adnan, the offspring of Ishmael, who originated in the north. European experts have confirmed the existence of two races in Arabia, the round-headed southerners and the long-headed northerners, but both have been in Arabia since the earliest times. Shut off from the outside world by the desert and the sea and the inhabitants of Arabia, they kept their racial purity. The neighboring countries, Egypt, Syria and Iraq, have been highways for invading armies and migrations, but there is no record of any migration into the Arabian Peninsula. Abyssinians, Persians, Egyptians and Turks imposed their uneasy rule at intervals on the Yemen, Oman, the Hijaz and even on the Najd. They held the larger towns and waged intermittent and often unsuccessful war against the tribes. The mercenaries spawned, especially in the seaports, but this is only the dirty froth upon the desert's edge. As I rode along, I reflected that nowhere in the world was there such continuity as the Arabian desert. Here, Semitic nomads resembling my companions must have herded their flocks before the pyramids were built, or the flood wiped out all trace of man in the Euphrates Valley. Successive civilizations rose and fell around the desert edge. The Menians, the Sabaeans, the Himyarites in southern Arabia, Egypt of the pharaohs, Sumeria, Babylonia, Assyria, the Hebrews, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, the Muslim empire of the Arabs, and finally the Turks. They lasted a few hundred or 1,000 years and vanished. New races were evolved and later disappeared. Religions rose and fell. Men, the pilgrim caravans, everyone in fact who moved about Arabia had to pass through the desert, and the Badu controlled the desert. They levied tolls on travelers or looted them at will. They extorted blackmail from villagers and civil cultivators and from the weaker desert nomads. Bedu raiders, as elusive as the bands of Norsemen who once harried the coast of Europe, had only to regain the desert to be free from pursuit, whether by Roman legionaries or Turkish mercenaries. The ascendancy of the Badu was, however, moral as well as physical. Valuing freedom far muted into the legendary heroes of the past. The Bedu themselves never doubted their superiority. Even today, such tribes as the Muter and the Ajman would not regard it as an honor to give a girl from their tents in marriage even to the king of Arabia. I remember asking some Rashid who had visited Riyadh how they had addressed the king, and they answered in surprise, "We called him Abdul Aziz. How else would we call him except by his name?" And when I said, "I thought you might call him Your Majesty," they answered, "We are Bedu. We have no king but God." After the First World War, cars, aeroplanes and wireless gave government for the first time in history a mobility greater than that of the Badu. The desert was no longer a refuge for raiders, but an open plain where concealment was impossible. It was a strange coincidence that at the same time as the Badu in the Syrian desert were being brought under control with the help of modern technology, the greatest king in Arabian history should reign in Central Arabia. Abdulaziz ibn Saud had already broken and brought to heel the most powerful tribes in the peninsula before he introduced a single car or aeroplane into his kingdom. The peace which he had imposed would normally have disappeared with his death, and the desert would have reverted to the state of anarchy necessary to Badu society. But I knew that the mechanical innovations which he had introduced would enable his successors to maintain the control which he had established. The desert had been pacified, and raids and tribal warfare had been effectively prevented from the Jordan Valley to the southern edge of the empty quarter. Only here on the far side of this great barrier of sand did the old way of life linger on, little affected as yet by the changes in the north. On the oil fields, the Bedu could find the money of which they dreamt. They could earn large sums by sitting in the shade and guarding a dump, or by doing work which was certainly easier than watering thirsty camels on a nearly dry well in the middle of the summer. There was plenty of good food, abundant sweet water, and long hours for sleep. They had seldom had these things before, and now they were being paid into the bargain. Their love of freedom and the restlessness that was in their blood drew most of them back into the desert, but life there was becoming more and more difficult. Soon it might be altogether impossible. Here in the south, the Badu was still unaffected by the economic changes in the north, but I knew that they could not long escape the consequences. It seemed to me tragic that they should become, as a result of circumstances beyond their control, a parasitic proletariat squatting around oil fields in the fly-blown squalor of shanty towns in some of the most sterile country in the world. All that is best in the Arabs has come to them from the desert. Their deep religious instinct, which has found expression in Islam, their sense of fellowship, which binds them as members of one faith, their pride of race, their generosity and sense of hospitality, their dignity and the regard which they have for the dignity of others as fellow human beings, their humor, their courage and patience, the language which they speak, and their passionate love of poetry. But the Arabs are a race which produce its best only under conditions of extreme hardship and deteriorates progressively as living conditions become easier. Lawrence described the nomad life as the circulation which kept vigor in the Semitic body, and wrote there were few, if indeed there was a single northern Semite whose ancestors had not at some dark age passed through the desert. The mark of nomadism, that most deep and biting social discipline, was on each of them in his degree. Now, as I rode along, ignoring Sultan's repeated injunctions to catch up with the others, which I knew were prompted by their cravings for conversation, that I was in no mood to supply, I reflected on the Arab influence on world history. It seemed to me significant that it was the desert Arabs who had imposed their characteristics on the Arab race, and not the more numerous inhabitants of the Yemen with the traditions of an ancient civilization. It was the customs and standards of the desert which had been accepted by townsmen and villagers alike, and which were spread by the Arab conquest across North Africa and the Middle East, and by Islam across a great part of the world. The civilization of the Yemen had sunk into decay before the time of Muhammad, and the dialects of the south had already been superseded by Northern Arabic as the classical language of Arabia. With the establishment of the new religion of Islam, the importance of the south declined still further, and the center of power shifted north to Mecca. The northern Arabs had no tradition of civilization behind them. To arrange 3 stones as a fireplace on which to set a pot was the only architecture that many of them required. They lived in black tents in the desert, or in bare rooms devoid of furnishings in the villages and towns. They had no taste nor inclination for refinements. Most of them demanded only the bare necessities of life, enough food and drink to keep them alive, clothes to cover their nakedness, some form of shelter from the sun, and wind weapons, a few pots, rugs, water skins, and their saddlery. It was a life which produced much that was noble, nothing that was gracious. These desert Arabs were avaricious, rapacious, and predatory, born freebooters, contemptuous of all outsiders, and intolerant of restraint. In the 7th century, united for the first time in their history, they swept out of Arabia under the banners of Islam and carried all before them. They overran the richest provinces of the Roman Empire and the whole of the Persian Empire. A little over a century after the Battle of Yarmouk in AD 636, which decided the fate of Syria, their rule extended from the Pyrenees and the shores of the Atlantic to the Indus and the borders of China. They had established an empire greater in extent than the Roman Empire. They had emerged from the desert craving for plunder and united by a new faith. It would not have been surprising if they had proved to be another scourge similar to the hordes of Attila and Genghis Khan, which swept across the world, leaving only devastation behind them. It is one of the miracles of history that they created a new civilization, uniting into one society the hitherto incompatible cultures of the Mediterranean and Persia. Arabic, which had been evolved as the dialect of nomad tribesmen in the deserts of Arabia, was soon spoken from Persia to the Pyrenees, and superseded Greek and Latin, developed into one of the great cultural languages of the world. As a Muslim faith and the Arabic language spread throughout the empire, the distinction between the Arabic conquerors and their subjects largely disappeared, and conquerors and conquered tended to become fellow Muslim in one community. Okay, I think we'll leave it there. So you can see how much admiration he has for the Arabs, and especially the Bedouin, and how true what he's saying is. Necessity breeds all invention. A lot of these codes and customs were made in order for the Arabs to survive, the Bedouins to survive. And life is a very precarious balance. It's a 3D wholesome entity. If you take something from here, something here will give. You take something from here, something here will give. So the advent of mechanized machinery, the advent of the coming of the oil fields and everything, chipped away at the Bedouin life. Even if they didn't want it, it would go, it would vanish. And today it pretty much has vanished. And if anybody lives as a Bedouin today, it's either he's far from civilization and dirt poor and he has to live like a Bedouin, or it's out of choice, where they have money and they hearken back to a simpler form of living. They want to live like their ancestors live, from afar. So you go into the desert, you have a few camels, you do some milking, you make coffee, you do some desert sports, and then you go back to your own creature comforts after a few days. That's the only way that the Arabs know how to live at the moment. The true Bedouin is a dying breed, and we have Fizla to thank that he has the last account of them in the 50s. So he ends here actually. He says, today 60 million people speaking Arabic as their native tongue, and most of them claim to be Arabs, although in fact few of them are of Arab descent. A seventh part of the human race professes Islam, the religion which Muhammad, peace be upon him, founded in Arabia in the 7th century. It is a religion which claims to regulate not only a Muslim's religious beliefs and the ritual of his religious observance, but also the structure of his society and every aspect of his daily life, even how he should wash after sexual intercourse. The customs and conventions which Islam imposed upon its adherents were those of Arabia. I knew that wherever I went amongst Muslims, whether it was in Nigeria or China, I should find much that was familiar to me in the pattern of their lives. It seemed to me not altogether fanciful to suppose that if the civilizations of today were to disappear as completely as those of Babylonia and Assyria, a school history book 2,000 years hence might devote a few pages to the Arabs and not even mention the United States of America. How pertinent. He mentions, so he's talking about how rough and tough and predatory they were by nature, and a few things was enough for them to live on. They coveted money just to survive, and by way of like khidmah, by way of feeding others. That was an honorable station to be. So that's the only reason they coveted wealth, not for what you and I would do. So he mentions that likewise beauty wouldn't move them. So when he would see, you know, the arc of the sun over a sand dune, or the color of the sand dunes change depending on different times of the day, or the moon on the sea, the Indian Ocean, that wouldn't move them. The only thing that would concern them is fertile grounds for their camels to feed on. Because once they were returning from Mugshin, as they left the desert and came upon the lush green of the Qura range, he remarked at how beautiful the land was, right? The hills were. And the Arab Bedouin says, it's rotten herbage. That's all he was concerned about. He goes, but still, on the other side, he goes, the people of Hadramaut had such beautiful architecture. You can still see that ancient architecture there, by the way, and it's in harmony with the environment. It sits perfectly there. Its construction material, how it's made with, you know, like these outcrops, that salient features that allow for the rain to go down, how they used earth. And granted, some of them are built in the Victorian style, you know, influence from Europe, but it's still in harmony with the area they're in. But the Bedouin Arabs in the desert didn't give none of that. He described them as small men, 5 foot 6 inches, very lean, not an ounce of fat on them. They had been weather beaten into dry leather, just enough to survive. They were always dignified, restrained, slow in speech, but their eyes caught everything. So in the desert, he mentions, as he was traveling with them, that any stranger that they came across was considered hostile and an enemy until he proved himself otherwise. He mentions a story of how they were in their small little camp and some strangers appeared upon the horizon. And straight away, action stations, they got up, they got their guns out. One of them hid the camels behind the hill and they said, "Who are you?" From afar they shouted, and they shot twice in the air. Right? And those other guys had to identify themselves. The way the other party would identify itself, that it's not a hostile entity, they'd get off their camels, they'd walk, they'd start to kick up sand with their feet, kicking up sand, showing them that, hey, we've come in peace. And the Arabs were so keen that from afar, their keen eyes would recognize exactly where they're from. By the way they walked, they'd know which tribe they were from. By their size, by their mannerisms, by the way they had their stitching on their thobes, ragtag thobes, on the way they put the belt on them, on the way they held their gun, they would identify them from different tribes. And that's not very strange actually, because when I was in Saudi Arabia, that happened to me twice also. I was walking once and there was a fellow person from my country and he recognized my lineage, subhanallah, just by my walk. He says, by the way you walked, I knew your lineage. There was another time when I was in a dawah camp and there was some other people there and we were speaking, discussing, and then afterwards they said to me, "What's your family name?" And the minute I told them my family name, he said, see, I knew it. This is his family. I knew this was his family. So these mannerisms, if you're from the same country, you're going to know what they are, right? And depending on how much you hold on to your family name, those mannerisms are going to be imbibed in you, and you're going to, people will observe them. So the Arabs knew this about each other, from the stitching on their shirts, the folds of their loincloth, the leather in which he carries his rifle, the way the rug is folded, and even the way he walks. And from his speech, of course, from the accent. And the first thing, when they would meet, is they would triple kiss on the nose, and then they would ask, what news? They'd always ask, what news? And today, the Arabs do this. Shu akhbarak, or shulunak, shu launak, what's your color? What's the news? Shu akhbarak, what news? So asking for the news was very important, and word got around. No matter how sparsely populated the desert was, how thinly traveled it was, news would get around. And it was important for people to ask about news, because then that would tell them where the enemy is, or where the fertile grounds for the herbage for the animals is, or where the rains are, and things like that. So that was very, very important for them to know where the watering holes are. And he noticed that the Arabs, no matter how desperate their living conditions, they would always first say, Alhamdulillah, the news is good. Alhamdulillah, the news is good. Which reminds me of the story of Ibrahim al-Islam, when he went to Ishmael in Mecca, where he left his son Ismail al-Islam, and he saw a woman, a young girl, at the threshold of the house, and he said, who are you? She said, I'm the wife of Ismail al-Islam. Ismail is my husband. And he said, how goes it? And she says, what can I tell you? Life is difficult, as you can see. So he conversed with her, and then as he was going, he said, tell him Ibrahim, his father, came, and he should change the threshold of his house. And the son understood that too, as indicating her, and so he left her. Then he married again, and the same story was played out, and this time the wife said, Alhamdulillah, everything is fine, everything is rosy, everything is good, even though they were desperately poor, right? So this is the same blood carrying on now, the same Arab blood, where everything is a blessing, everything is a mercy, Alhamdulillah, they would say. And this is exactly what's happening today in Gaza, and as a result, many people, even religious Christians, Catholic Christians, they said, we never experienced this kind of faith. We're church-going people, we're religious people, but this faith is on another level. And that faith is what's seeing the Palestinians, the Gazans, survive psychologically and emotionally, and that's what's made them most beloved, the most beloved people in the world today, and the Israelis and the Zionists the most hated. And many are converting due to this. In fact, Lewisham Mosque in London, one of their posts said that since the war has started, well, it's not really a war, it's a massacre, it's a genocide, one-sided genocide, there is no war. Since the genocide started, every day we have people coming into our mosque converting into Islam, and when we ask them the reason why, 80 to 90% of them cite Palestine. So alhamdulillah, for those people that say, if there is a God that loves you, and how can he allow suffering? This is a theological debate for a theological lesson, and there are clear-cut answers. Other religions don't have answers for this. Alhamdulillah, Islam has an answer for this. One of them you can see straight away. Everything is a blessing. Everything in your life is a blessing on how you perceive it. Your perception of it either makes it a blessing, which it is, but you see it as a blessing, or you make life hard for yourself. So on one side, Allah's testing them, purifying them, allowing them in Jannah for free. And as a result, everybody else is becoming Muslim who's observing that. The same people that supported Israel are now supporting the Gazans and are embracing the same faith that the Israelis for the last 70 years had been saying is a terrorist faith, that America had been saying is a terrorist faith. The same people are now becoming Muslim. Why? Because of the strong iman they see, because of the alhamdulillah that comes out of their lips, because of who? The wife of Ismail alayhi salam. Subhanallah. So we need to understand reality for what it is. We need the correct lens and the correct perspective. And what teaches you that? Islam teaches you that. If you haven't got an answer, look in the books of Islam, you'll find the answer to everything. So I'm going to read again from page 135, because I won't be able to do justice to what he said here. So this is the same story. He's talking about how they meet. So two people they meet. They approached and said, Assalamu alaikum, alaikum assalam. And then after we had exchanged the news, they handed us a bowl of milk, its surface crusted with brown sand. These Beit Imani belonged to the same section of the Rashid as Al-Auf and bin Kabina, and were from 3 different families. Only one of them, a grizzled elderly man called Khutim, wore a shirt over his loincloth, and all were bareheaded. They had no tent, their only possessions were saddles, ropes, bowls, empty goatskins, and their rifles and daggers. The camping ground was churned and furrowed where the camels slept, and littered with camel droppings, hard and clean on the sand like dried dates. These men were cheerful and full of talk. The grazing was good, their camels, several in milk, would soon be fat. Life by their standards would be easy this year. But I thought of other years when the exhausted scouts rode back to the wells to speak through blackened, bleeding lips of desolation in the sands of emptiness, such as I myself had seen on the way back from Ghanim, when the last withered plants were gone, and walking skeletons of men and beasts sank down to die. Even tonight, when they considered themselves well off, these men would sleep naked on the freezing sand, covered only with their flimsy loincloths. I thought too of the bitter wells in the furnace heat of summer, when hour by reeling hour they watered thirsty, thrusting camels, until at last the wells ran dry and importuned camels moaned for water which was not there. I thought how desperately hard were the lives of the Badu in this weary land, and how gallant and how enduring was their spirit. Now listening to their talk and watching the little acts of courtesy which they instinctively performed, I knew by comparison how sadly I must fail, how selfish I must prove. Bin Kamina was one of the boys he travelled with. Bin Gobesha and Bin Kamina, 16-year-old boys, were his companions. And he was a boy who hardly had any clothes. He was desperately poor, had nothing. He would sleep on the floor in the freezing cold of the desert night, not once asking for a blanket or a pillow, and not having 2 pieces of cloth. In some of the pictures which you can find on the net, he has a 2-piece cloth, but other times he's literally just got a waist wrapper around him. A 16-year-old boy being bought and raised to live on his own, to travel the empty quarter and survive and not be scared, and to have enough nobility in him, developed as a man, in the nature of a man had been developed in him at such a young age that he was noble in his actions. He never complained about nothing. Never complained about nothing. So an argument can be made here as well that why do people marry girls like on the cusp of puberty? Like the marriage of Rasulullah with Aisha, Sayyidina Aisha anha, right? Even though that's been mentioned many times of the reasons why there was a need to marry young girls, up to pre-modern times there was a huge need to marry very, very young girls for reasons. Just the fact that they develop much faster, whether it's mentally, emotionally, spiritually, even physically, there's your answer there. So today where you have teenagers, 19 going on 12, or you have 30-year-old men going on 19, of course you're not going to see that. You don't want to marry immature people, right? Girls tend to marry much older guys. Why? Because they don't want immature men, and men tend to marry younger girls because of fertility and things like that. So that's another argument in itself, but a small argument can be made for that here as well. A bit more reading. So once we passed a dozen camels tended by a woman with 2 small children. Al-Auf said, "Let's get a drink," and we rode over to them. He jumped from his camel, greeted the woman, and a wizened old thing bundled up in black cloth, turning green with age, took the bowl which she handed him and went towards the camels. She shrilled at her sons, "Hurry, hurry, fetch the red one, fetch the 2-year-old. God take you, child, hurry, fetch the red one, fetch the 2-year-old. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the guests." Now notice how poor they were themselves, and yet they were welcoming the guests. Al-Auf handed us the bowl, and in turn we squatted down to drink. For no Arab drinks standing, while the old woman asked us where we were going. We answered that we were going to fight for the Al-Bufala, and she explained, "God give you victory." On another occasion we came upon a small encampment of Manisr. Hamid insisted that we must go over to them or we should arouse their suspicion. And since they had already seen us, we were on foot at the time, and I suggested that they should leave the camels to graze and that I should herd them until they returned. After some argument, they agreed. I knew they wanted milk, and I should have liked to drink myself, but it seemed stupid to run the risk of detection. When they returned, bin Kamina grinned whenever he looked at me. So I asked him what the joke was. He said, the Manisr gave us milk but insisted that we should fetch you, saying, why do you leave your companion without milk? Al-Auf explained that you were our slave, but they still insisted that we should fetch you. I knew that among Badu, even a slave is considered as a traveling companion, entitled to the same treatment as the rest of the party. Bin Kabira went on. Finally, Al-Auf said, oh, he is half-witted, leave him there where he is. And the Manisr insisted no more. So he describes another instance of how the slaves are treated there. So slavery amongst the Arabs was not how we understand, we have the image and idea of slavery that we saw chattel slavery in the West, or the concept of Roman slaves and all this. They had a certain amount of autonomy. So you could be a slave and still be walking around the market, still be doing your own thing, still be able to get married and have your own family, but you would just serve when you needed to serve. So it's like a servant even. And you could even buy your freedom. And we know that the slaves had power. Even in this book, he mentions that the slaves of the chief of the ruler of Oman had a certain amount of autonomy and power, and people didn't like to deal with them because they were a bit aloof and they had power. But we know in Islamic history that slaves have ended up becoming generals and founding their own empires. The Mamluks were slave soldiers that founded their own empire in Egypt, and that were responsible for defeating the last Mongol hordes from Mongolia. If it wasn't for them, where would the Arab lands be today? And certainly the Arabs in their nobility would eat with your slave. When the king of Arabia went to America, and in the Ward of Historia he sat down with the president and whoever to eat, they were shocked when his black slave sat on the table, the same table as him, to eat. Because they would obviously have on their windows no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, right? So it's very important to differentiate and understand. Many of the ignorances that we show is only because we do not study Islamic literature. We don't study, and then we get these misconstrued ideas, and those ideas are fed by Orientalists that only have one agenda, which is to rubbish Islam. If they had sincere academic rigor, they wouldn't come to the conclusions they did. And we need to understand that. And don't be ashamed or shy of your own tradition. Learn it, and it'll give you all the clear answers. So he also mentions that you can go up to any goat or any cow, any camel or any goat. If you see on route, you can milk it, and no one's going to accuse you of stealing. Because you need to, they will do the same to you, you will do the same to them. That's how you survive. And you can go and sit in any encampment and just start eating. Any desert encampment, walk up there and start eating. By default, you're invited. And nobody will say, what are you doing? And you had better do that. Why? Because tomorrow they're going to do the same thing to you, and that will ensure your survival, and that will ensure their survival as well. He goes, Bedouins are so chivalrous that they would rather watch a man die than to watch him be humiliated. I think I'll have to read the description again. It is characteristic of Badu to do things by extremes, to be either wildly generous or unbelievably mean, very patient or almost hysterically excitable, to be incredibly brave or to panic for no apparent reason. Aesthetic by nature, they derive satisfaction from the bare simplicity of their lives and scorn the amenities which others would judge essential. Although on the rare occasions that offer, they eat enormously. I have never met a Badu who was greedy. Continent for months on end, not one of them, even the most austere, would regard celibacy as a virtue. They want sons and consider that women are provided by God for the satisfaction of men. Deliberately to refrain from using them would be not only unnatural but also ridiculous, and the Badu are very susceptible to ridicule. Yet an Arab will use his sister's name as his battle cry, and Glubb has suggested that the medieval conception of chivalry came to Europe from the Arabs at the time of the Crusades. Badu sat Badu set great scores by human dignity, and most of them would prefer to watch a man die rather than see him humiliated. Always reserved in front of strangers and accustomed on formal occasions to sit for hours motionless and in silence. They are a garrulous, light-hearted race, but at the instigation of religious zealots, they can become uncompromisingly puritanical, quick to frown on all amusement regarding song and music as a sin and laughter as unseemly. Probably no other people, either as a race or as individuals, combine so many conflicting qualities in such an extreme degree. So on tribe and protection, I'm going to read some more. What is the news? It is the question which follows every encounter in the desert, even between strangers. Given a chance, the Bedouin will gossip for hours as they had done last night, and nothing is too trivial for them to recount. There is no reticence in the desert. If a man distinguishes himself, he knows that his fame will be widespread. If he disgraces himself, he knows that the story of his shame will inevitably be heard in every encampment. It is this fear of public opinion which enforces at all times the rapid conventions of the desert. The consciousness that they are always before an audience makes many of their actions theatrical. Glub once told me of a Badu sheikh who was known as the host of the wolves, because whenever he heard a wolf howl round his tent, he ordered his son to take a goat out in the desert, saying he would have no one call on him for dinner in vain. It was late in the afternoon when Salim spread a rug in front of us and placed on it a large tray covered with rice. He lifted joints of meat from the cauldron and put them on this, ladled soup over the rice, and finally tipped a dishful of butter over it. He then poured water over our outstretched hands. Old Muhammad invited us to eat, but refused our invitation to join us. He stood and watched us, saying, "Eat, eat. You are hungry, you are tired, you have come a long way. Eat." He shouted to Salim to bring more butter, although we protested that there was enough already, and taking the dish from Salim's hand, poured it over the rice. Gorged at last, we licked our fingers and rose together, muttering, "God requite you." We washed using water. There was no need here to clean our fingers with sand, for the well was nearby. Salim then handed us coffee, and the bitter drops were welcome and clean tasting after the greasy rice and cold lumps of fat which we had eaten. He and his father urged us to remain with them at least for another day to rest ourselves and our camels, and we willingly agreed. They bought us milk at sunset, and we drank till we could drink no more, and each of us handed back the bowl from which we had drunk. He said, "God bless her." A blessing on the camel who had given the milk. Some more on the generosity here. He mentions another story of a companion that they were traveling with was dying, literally dying, and he only heard about it because they mentioned him. I think he had joined the encampment, and then he went over to that person, and somehow the person was barely alive. He ended up giving him some medicine, and he recovered after a few days, and he went on his way. He says that for them, death and life is the same thing. He was dying, he was dying. It's fated. But these things won't affect a Bedouin. But their code of honor is so strict upon themselves that they would have protected him to the death in case of any attack, to the detriment of their whole encampment. You know, that's how much their code of honor meant. And you can see that in instances of the Sīrah, where Abu Jahl and those people, you know, even as they were dying, they tried to die in a way like, we're not scared, we're brave, and how goes the news, like this. And Hamza Yusuf mentions a story when he went to see his sheikh, he cried, and the students over there, they said to him, "You're crying?" And he says, "Of course, you know, it's an emotional moment, I've come to see my teacher." And they said, "The harsh desert has dried our tears." So there's this spirit inside them that they have that's made them one with the desert. The desert is harsh, they've become harsh, and their code has become just as stoic as the unchanging sands. Everything is code. A man's life is his honor. If he has no honor, it's like he has no life. So they go to extreme lengths to safeguard their honor. And we'll see more of this in the subject of Jahiliyyah, and it'll come up in the Seerah as well. So because their honor is paramount, they have something, they have blood for blood, like the law of Talon, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, limb for a limb, life for a life. We'll discuss this more in Jahiliyyah, inshallah, in the lesson of Jahiliyyah, but there's something interesting that he read here on a desert raid. He wrote something here. I can't find it on the book, but he mentions a desert raid gone wrong. So a raiding party had raided another desert encampment and tried to take their camels, and as a result the son of the father was shot and he was killed. Right, okay, so normally in a desert raid you try to avoid attacking each other, or you try to avoid touching the women. So it's just basically game for game. It's for the camels. But in this instance the son was killed. Where, according to me, that's natural. You're going to protect your property, and if somebody dies, then he knew that this was the price he was going to pay to come for you. You don't know what else he might do, so you shot him and he died. But now the father wanted revenge. So the father put the dead body of the son on the camel. They're being chased themselves. They're being chased, so they're running from the raiders, and they're going to a place now where the other tribes people are. And the father sees a 14-year-old boy. Now, there's only women in that encampment. There's only a woman hanging around. She can't do much. And he corners this boy. And the boy is cornered into the corner. And the boy puts his thumbs into his mouth like this. This is a sign of submissiveness. That, I'm no harm to you. I'm submissive to you. Don't kill me. The father steps off his camel, pulls out his dagger, and stabs him in the chest. And watches him crumple to the ground. And watches him die. And then his thirst for blood has been slaked a little bit at the death of his own son, and then he carries on. So this is a very late example in literature of Bedouin retribution, Jahiliya retribution. This law is a law that's practiced in many parts of the world. The Yemenis do it, the Albanians do it, the tribes in India do it, Pakistan do it, the Afghans are known for doing this, and Bedouin tribes in Arabia still do this. For their honor, their misplaced honor, they will do stuff like this. So you've just killed a 14-year-old son who had nothing to do, 14-year-old kid who had nothing to do with what happened to you or your son. You were the criminals, in fact, and you've gone and killed a very young child, an innocent child, for nothing. And there are many, many stories like this. For their honor, they would do many things. He mentions a story in Iraq, in his other book, where a gunshot ran out in the middle of the night, and it was in a small town there was, so he went out to see, and it was isolated to the house of a brother who had shot his sister, because there were rumors that she had done something. Now, as she was dying, she just said one thing. She said, I don't mind if I'm going to die. My brother did the correct thing. But she called the British agent, the British standing officer of that town, and she said, I just want you to tell my brother that I was innocent. I didn't do what I've been charged with. He's killed me. I'm proud of him. But I just want you to know that I was innocent. So that's the length, that's their society. It's an honor-based society. And most traditional societies were like this about 100 years ago, 200 years at least. He says, as part of the nobility, he goes, they'll curse. They'll curse, may God take you, may your house be destroyed. He goes, but it's very circumspect and to the point. It's not that filthy cursing and low talk that you get from the Arabs in towns and other people. He goes, they're even dignified in the way they swear, and it's always meaningful and not meaningless and low. And he goes, they never ever spoke about sex. He goes, how could they, when starving bodies don't need sex, they need food. They never mentioned homosexuality. Now, Lawrence of Arabia, who was homosexual himself, mentions homosexual stories in his book, 7 Pillars of Wisdom and Amongst the Arabs. And we don't know if they're true or not, but we do know that homosexuality does exist in towns, even Arab towns. But the Bedouins were pure. He goes, in 5 years, he never heard the Bedouins talk about homosexuality. The only time it was mentioned twice, and even then it was mentioned in another context. So they mentioned a head chopping they saw in Riyadh, and it was a young guy that had raped a boy, and I think killed him, and his head was chopped off, and they agreed with that. And then there was 2 boys that they saw in one of those southern cities when they went back to town, and Bin Kabina pointed out, he said one of them, he goes, he's one of those boys that they end up using for sexual purposes. That was it. They never mocked or joked or made innuendos about sex. Because of their harshness and their gruffness and sometimes their behavior is a bit different from civilized people in civilized societies, sorry, not civilized people, but civilized societies. Bin Kabina, the young kid he was with, he gave him something, some clothing, and Bin Kabina never thanked him. He just took it stoically, silently. But he would then thank him in other ways, where it was more needed. Like, to say a thank you and then do nothing about it, what kind of a thank you is that? The fact that his silence was there and the fact that he took it was the appreciation of the gift, and to then do something for him, which he did do later on, was a true measure of his expression of gratitude. So then he mentions circumcision. Once he mentions one of the boys coming to him, I think it was Bin Kabina. He mentions about circumcision, of how 8 boys were circumcised together, and this guy Bin Kabina had almost died, and because he was circumcised with a blunt knife, no anesthetic, no nothing, and it was done on past puberty, and 8 boys were circumcised together. And he mentions how some of the rites of circumcision. Now, some of these rites harken back to days of Jahiliyyah, and you could imagine these happening in many simple, primitive societies across the world. But to see it happen with the Bedouin very late in the day in the Arabian desert, it's, I wouldn't say it's strange, but it's a bit disappointing. So 8 boys were taken to be circumcised on a rock. Everybody came out to see it. It was a big spectacle. They were rubbed with butter on their body and saffron to make their bodies shine. And they have to be men, right? You can't squirm, you can't scream. If you do, you disgrace yourself, you disgrace your family, you disgrace your tribe, and you'll be disgraced forever afterwards. One guy did that. He screamed and they said, "May God blacken his face." That's what they remember him by. So these guys have to sit there, these young kids, stoically without making anything. And he tied the foreskin with string until it died, and then hacked with a blunt knife without antiseptic or anesthetic. And then on the wounds was put a mixture of salt, ashes and camel dung. You can only imagine the pain increasing. The pain from using a blunt knife without anesthesia, and then to put this on there. And he didn't heal. Some of the people don't heal for 2-3 months, and some die. He mentioned how he started to bleed that night, and he bled so much that they thought he was going to die. And because he was weak the next time Khizr saw him, and he said this is the reason why. And many of the Arabs don't circumcise till just before their wedding night. Some of them circumcise. Some of them circumcise as adults. Now, why that is, each tribe, each locality have their own custom which they mix with religion. Some of them may be financial, some of it may be ignorance, some of it is custom. I think I'll read from the book because it's probably said in a more dramatic fashion. So when it's talking about the blood stopping, so when it stopped, they thought it was because I was dead. There was 8 of us, and we were circumcised by one of the sheikhs at the Beit Khawar in the valley of the Kidyat. One of us was a manahil, a grown man with a beard, and others were Beit Khawar. They were all older than I. Before the operation, our families rubbed our bodies with butter and saffron so that they shone. We were circumcised in turn, sitting on a rock. Everyone had come out to watch, and there was a large crowd. I asked him if he had been afraid, and he said, "Of course I was. Everyone is afraid when they know that they are going to be hurt, but they don't admit it. I was most afraid that I should flinch. As I was the youngest, I was done first. The old man tied my foreskin very tightly with a piece of string and then left it to die. By God, it hurt. It was almost a relief when he cut it off, though his knife was blunt, and he went on hacking away for what seemed ages. One of the others fainted. I interrupted to ask if they put anything on the wound. Yes, he said, a mixture of salt, ashes and powdered camel dung. It stung like fire. He went on. We were operated on in the evening. I started to bleed during the night. I had been asleep and woke up to feel a warm wetness on my thighs. The sheepskin on which I lay was soaked with blood. It was pitch dark and we could not see anything until my mother lit a fire. I had bled very little when they cut it off, he added with pride. The people who were watching said that I showed no sign of pain while I was being done. He told me that he had healed in 3 weeks, but that 2 of the others, one of them, Manahil with a beard, was still unhealed and very swollen when he left them 2 months later. When I asked why they waited till they were grown up to be operated on, he said that it was their custom, and added with a grin that some of the Mahra waited until the eve of their marriage. I wondered what effect it had on a boy to grow up anticipating their ordeal. Probably it was resigned, for he had no choice but to submit to it. Certainly during the operation, the fear of lasting ridicule if he flinched gave him courage to endure, and his pride made him anxious to face the test. In southern Iraq, I have seen 14 and 15-year-old boys thrusting each other aside as they crowded forward, as eager to be circumcised as boys buy sweets at the counter of a school shop in England. And in the Sudan, I have met Arab boys who had circumcised themselves because their fathers had delayed giving permission for the operation. Yet amongst Arabs, circumcision is not a coveted sign conferring special privileges and marking the emergence of a boy into manhood, as it is amongst many primitive tribes such as the Maasai. Bin Kabina had undergone the normal circumcision obligatory for all Muslims, although it is usually performed on a child about the age of 7. As I sat there talking to him, I thought of the ceremony I had watched 5 months earlier in the distant Tihama. For a fortnight, the young men who were to be circumcised had danced each evening and late into the night, waiting for the day when the old men would announce that the positions of the moon and stars were favorable. See, that is un-Islamic and to do with Jahiliyyah. The initiates wore tight, short-sleeved red jackets and baggy white drawers, tight at the ankle, the only time in their lives when they wore drawers, which were women's dress. On the appointed day, riding on camels, they were paraded behind the musicians round the neighbouring villages and then brought back just before sunset, followed by a large crowd on their own village. To their own village. Their friends helped them to take off their drawers, and then one after the other, these young men, looking like girls with their flowing hair and delicate features, stepped forward in front of the tribe. Each of them stood with legs apart and his hands gripping his long hair, staring motionless and unflinching at a dagger stuck in the ground in front of him, while a slave handled his penis until it was erect and then flayed the entire organ. When the slave stepped aside, his work as at last completed, the lad sprung forward and, to the compelling rhythm of the drums, danced frenziedly before the eager craning crowd, leaping and capering while the blood splashed down his legs. This is the modified form of a rite far older than Islam. In the Hijaz mountains, some of the tribes still performed the flaying circumcision, which was often postponed until a man was married and had children, and in which the skin was removed from the navel down to the inside of the legs. Ibn Saud forbade even the modified form of this circumcision, which he declared was a pagan custom, but the young men were prepared to risk the severest punishment rather than forego the credit of submitting to this rite. On this particular occasion, one of them had already been circumcised as a child, but he insisted on undergoing this second operation. Even after it was over, their suffering were not yet ended. Each morning they were held down over a small hole in the ground so that their mutilated parts dangled down to kippa in the heat and smoke which came up from a fire below. Lads who had stood unmoved while they were circumcised screamed with the agony of this barbarous treatment. I described what I had seen to Bin Kabina, who said that it is not circumcision, it is butchery. So Jahiliyyah never really escapes anybody. There's always an element, a seed of Jahiliyyah that stays. Islam came to remove it, and we'll have a look at the concept of Jahiliyyah. Jahiliyyah is more of a concept. And out of that concept comes a mode of thinking and actions that are jahil. And we'll have a look at that in detail. Jahiliyyah wasn't specific to Arabia, it's a universal global concept, which still stands today. It's interesting that he says that the flaying of the penis part, they took it down all the way to the thigh. When I was living in Jazan 10 years ago, working there was a Wadi Lajab and the surrounding mountains, they say only became Muslim when King Abdulaziz came to the throne. Why? Because that's when they had aeroplanes, and they flew aeroplanes over those. It's close to Yemen. They flew aeroplanes over, and they saw for the first time that there were tribes there, isolated tribes. So they sent da'is up to give da'wah, and they became Muslim. This is what they say anyway. A fellow teacher with me, he was only there because his wife was doing a PhD study on that particular tribe. And it's famous for magic. Every time I said I want to go there, they would say, oh, magic, don't go there, jinn, and things like that. And he said that he had interviewed people that said young, old men that said in our youth, we never knew Islam. We didn't know Islam, we were taught Islam afterwards. So that obviously adds credibility to the story that they were converted after the advent of aeroplanes. And that as part of their witchcraft training, they had to flay their skin from their belly, moving down to the thighs, both thighs. So some of the old men had flayed skin on their thighs that healed, like probably scarred really badly. And that was a sign that they had that they were witch doctors, soothsayers, witch doctors, and that those same people as children said that we want Muslims. Subhanallah. I don't know how true that story is, but so Allah A'lam, if they were exaggerating or if that was the truth. Sometimes in ignorance people say that, they don't have no knowledge of Islam. They're probably born Muslims, they knew about one God and everything, but because they're practicing now and they weren't practicing then, they sometimes say, oh, we want Muslims. You've heard these statements before. But I believe, from two separate sources I heard different stories. Maybe it's possible that this is the truth, that Islam came to them very late. But interesting stories of the Bedouin. Just some information on the two travel companions now, before we wrap up. So one was Salim bin Ghubaysha and one was bin Kabina. You could see their documentaries if you type it in Arabic on YouTube. And these are the pictures of them. Wilfred Tizja describes Salim bin Ghubaysha as having a face of classic beauty, pensive and rather sad in repose, but which lit up when he smiled, like a pool touched by the sun. Bin Ghubaysha went on to become a raider, a well-seasoned raider of camels, even as a young child. The others tended to rely on his judgment, as I did myself. He was certainly the best rider and the best shot, and always graceful in everything he did. He had a quick smile and a gentle manner, but I always suspected that he could be both reckless and ruthless, and I was not surprised when within 2 years he had become one of the most daring outlaws of the crucial coast, with half a dozen blood feuds on his hands. That's it for today. Inshallah, the next lesson we'll carry on with more information on pre-Islamic Arabia before moving on to the actual Sīrah. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi adada kamalillahi wa kama يليق بكماله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على أسعد محمد وعلى آله عدد كمال الله وكما يليق بكماله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على نور الهدى محمد وعلى آله عدد كمال الله وكما يليق بكماله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.